Morning and welcome to the second webinar. We're just trying to get my screen up. Okay. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. Part 4 refers to Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, which deals with individual property designations. Now, as a result of the last webinar where we dealt with the role of municipal heritage committees and the questions raised about heritage easement agreements, I've added a bit of information about heritage easement agreements, which you will see abbreviated as HEAs. So just a bit of information about me. I've been involved with Municipal Heritage Committee for 20 years. I've also dealt with my own property, which was designated under the Ontario Heritage Act by Newmarket Municipality, and dealt with alterations to that property. So I've dealt with it from the perspective of a property owner. I've also been staff to a municipality, the City of Toronto, and I've dealt with the designation and alteration of individually designated properties from a staff perspective. I'm currently a heritage planning consultant, so I often am called in to advise on that and do heritage impact assessments when people are proposing to alter an individually designated property. And I'm a professional planner, a member of the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals, and Director and Vice President of Community Heritage Ontario. So the outline of my talk, you'll see here, we'll start off with why you would designate a property, what is a Part 4 designation. We'll look specifically at a designation bylaw, an example, and go through that bylaw. We'll talk about the report that you would send forward supporting the designation. We'll then talk about what properties can be designated as the right criteria set out for the designation of properties. We'll talk about the effect of a Part 4 designation on the property, and then the process for designating a property, and finally we'll deal with heritage easement agreements. So why would you designate a property? Designation can prevent demolition of a building on a designated property. It can prevent demolition by neglect, so somebody is avoiding to maintain their heritage property, although this would have to be combined with a property standards bylaw passed under the Ontario Heritage Act by the municipality. Another reason would be to prevent an inappropriate alteration to a heritage property, so it allows the municipality to manage change to the heritage attributes of a designated property. Another reason is to ensure that the heritage values of that property are included in any redevelopment. So often when a planning application comes in, it can involve designating the property if it's not already designated. Another reason is that it can be a requirement if you want a heritage grant or a property tax reduction from the municipality. Another reason that isn't often discussed but can be a possibility is for relief under the building code. Designation also provides recognition of the heritage value of the property. And finally, we could be designating the property as a request or as the result of a request from an owner or from interested groups in the community. So a wide variety of reasons for designating a property. So what is Part 4 designation? It's a bylaw authorized by the Ontario Heritage Act passed by a municipality. So this is the bylaw passed by a municipality and registered on title to the property. And the authority for this comes from the Ontario Heritage Act, Section 29(1), that says the council of a municipality may by bylaw designate a property within the municipality to be of cultural heritage value or interest. And one of the important points I've underlined is property. It's the property that you're designating. It's not the structures on the property. They are the reasons for designating it, but it's actually the property that is designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. So the format of a designation bylaw consists of three things: a standard preamble to the bylaw, and then two attached schedules. The reasons for designation, which is often referred to as Schedule A or Schedule 1, and the property description, Schedule B or Schedule 2. So let's take a look in a bit more detail on these sections of the designation bylaw. And before we do that, let's look at the Ontario Heritage Act and what it says about a designation bylaw. So the council, and it's section 29(6) and 4, and it says the council shall, by a bylaw, pass a bylaw designating the property, cause a copy of the bylaw together with a statement explaining the cultural heritage value or interest of the property and a description of the heritage attributes of the property, to be served on the owner of the property and on the trust, and to be registered against the property affected in the proper land registry office. So a couple of important points here. Within the bylaw, you need a statement explaining the cultural heritage value or interest of the property, and you need a description of the heritage attributes of that property. And the list of heritage attributes is important, as we'll see later. So the example of a designation bylaw I'm going to use is 28 Daisy Avenue, which you see pictured in this slide. If you want to look at the bylaw itself, here is the website where you can find the bylaw. It's bylaw Toronto City of Toronto bylaw 772-2013. So you remember I mentioned there were three parts, the first part being the preamble. I haven't reproduced it in its entirety. It's the section I usually refer to as the whereases, because each of the clause in this section begins whereas. And the first whereas is usually the Ontario Heritage Act authorizes the designation, and it'll make reference to Section 29. Then the next whereas will be council has authorized this designation. And the third whereas will be the Ontario Heritage Act process has been followed, and that includes issuing the notice of intention, of council's intention to designate. And then it'll say the reasons for the designation are attached to Schedule 2. And then the legal description of the property being designated is attached to Schedule B. So that's the preamble. And we'll go into the description of the property first, which is Schedule B. And in the City of Toronto's case, they've also referred to it as Schedule C, the legal description. So you see here, 28 Daisy Avenue, the legal description. So this is exactly what appears in the bylaw, the writing on the left-hand side. The PIN number, PIN standing for Property Identification Number. So that comes from the registry office. And then the legal description, and this is the abbreviations used in the registry office. It's part of lot, so PT, LT is part of lot 109, PL is plan 1571, as in, and this would be a document registered on title in registry office as in TB 64 1970. And this is in the former city, in the City of Toronto, formerly the City of Etobicoke, and the Province of Ontario, the Land Titles Division, number 66. And then they've said there, the herein before described land being delineated by a heavy line outline on a sketch attached to Schedule C. It's not a requirement that you include a sketch, but the City of Toronto likes to include a sketch, which appears on the right-hand side. So there you see a map of Daisy Avenue, which is attached to Schedule C, and the heavy outline around the property. And the heavy outline includes, within it, there is an outline of the buildings that are on the property. So you can see the house and some accessory buildings on the property. So that's the property that's being designated. This is Schedule B. So let's turn to the reasons for designation. Oh, sorry, let's describe, look at a bit more at the legal description. This is something you would get from the registry office, both the property identification number and the legal description. Now the assessment roll, which you'll find in the clerk's office, provides a short legal description. It may be exactly the same as the legal description you'll find in the registry office. However, it's a short legal description, and it could be an abbreviation of a much longer legal description. You do need to check in the registry office to make sure you get the full legal description and not just the short one that appears on the assessment roll. The other point to keep in mind is that you can designate the whole property, or you can designate part of the property. But in order to designate part of the property, you need to include a reference plan. So this is done by a surveyor. It's a plan that sets out that part of the property that you want to designate. And the reference plan would be registered together with the designation bylaw. And that you may find this occurring on a large farm property where you just want to designate the farmhouse, and you want to make it clear to everybody that that's the only part of the property that is being designated. So you can designate part of a legal property. As I said, just you have to include a reference plan. So now let's take a look at the designation bylaw and the reasons for designation. Schedule A, and this is often referenced as the Statement of Significance or the Statement of Cultural Heritage Value. And the suggested format is a description including the criteria, so why you are designating this property. The second part is a statement of the heritage values of the property. And the third is the attributes. And you'll remember when I talked about what the Ontario Heritage Act says you have to include in the designation bylaw. This is a requirement. And it's normally 1 to 2 pages in length. So you're not writing a full report. You're simply writing a description that will guide people in the future as to what the heritage value of the property is and what the important heritage attributes are on that property. So let's take a look at it in detail now. So the description of the property. So this is what it says about 28 Daisy Avenue. The property at 28 Daisy Avenue is worthy of designation under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act for its cultural heritage value and meets the criteria for municipal designation prescribed by the province under 3 categories of, and we'll talk about these categories later, but in this case it's saying it meets the 3 categories of design, associative, and contextual values. And it says it's located on the northeast corner of Daisy Avenue and 26th Street in Long Branch. The Richard Newborn House, circa 1851, is a 1.5-story house form building. The site is listed on the City of Toronto Heritage Inventory, or Inventory of Heritage Properties. So that's a brief description of the property. It describes where it is and why it's being designated. Now, the statement of cultural heritage value, this goes into a bit more detail, but not a lot. So looking at it, it says the Richard Newborn House is a rare surviving example of a stone house form building in Etobicoke and the only one remaining in Long Branch. In its original location, so that's an important point. You're saying this is where it was located and this is a value. It's in its original location facing south towards Lakeshore Boulevard West and Lake Ontario. It is purported, and this is a nice word that's often put in when you're not exactly sure and you can't find the full documentary evidence, so this is a nice word to say it's purported to be the oldest remaining farmhouse along the Etobicoke waterfront between the Humber River and the Etobicoke Creek. While its stonework is concealed by stucco cladding, the structure retains the form of a character Ontario house. So this is style. It's an Ontario house with its 1.5-story profile and the central gable. The property at 28 Daisy Avenue contributes to an understanding of the early development of southwest Etobicoke Township as a farming community prior to the area's evolution as a seasonal resort and its incorporation as the village of Long Branch. With the partitioning of the original farm lot for a residential subdivision, the Richard Newborn House stands as a reminder of the area's historical origin. As a rare extant stone farmhouse in Longbridge, the Richard Newborn House is a local landmark that is recognized on the City of Toronto Inventory of Heritage Properties. So that's the statement. We now get into the attributes. So that's the extent. And I should point out some of the reasons for designation that I've had to work with have gone into far too much information about the biography of the people that have lived in the house. Pare it down, keep it to the point, and the biographical information you can include in a background report. So we're now dealing with the heritage attributes. This is important because it's saying to everybody, this is what we value about the building and the property, and this is what we're going to be watching and monitoring in the future. So you start broadly with the list of attributes, and then you move systematically through the details of the structure or the property. And as I said, this list is important because it will be used as a basis in the future by people you may not even know who come along later on and say what's important. So for people dealing with alterations. Another point is consider the position of the structures on the property. So that should be an important factor. Is it in its original location? How does it relate to the list, the rest of the property? And you may include in this list things that are not to be designated. So you could say the tail wing of the house is not important and is not being included in the designation. So it is possible to include and make clear certain features that are not being included in the designation bylaw. So let's take a look at Daisy Avenue and what it says about this house. It's a 1.5-story house form building. The scale, form, massing on a rectangular shaped plan. So it's saying the building scale, the form and the massing of that building is important. So it's 1.5-story, the form that the building takes right now and the scale is important. The stone foundation, the walls and detailing, and it notes that the building has been clad in stucco. We then start with the roof and talk about the roof. It's a gable roof with brick chimneys, a gable peak with a flat-headed window opening on the south slope. So keep in mind the material in which the roof is clad is not mentioned, so it's not a heritage attribute. So you could change the shingles without seeking a change or permission from the municipality, although it could be interpreted that if you're changing the type of material, you're affecting the heritage attribute, the roof. Okay, the principal or south facade is important with its symmetrically organized, which is symmetrically organized with a central entrance. It then describes that entrance, the main entry, which is set in a wood surround with 3/4 length paneled side lights with round arched windows and a flat multi-pane transom. Flanking the entrance, the flat-headed window openings that incorporate arched windows. Fenestration, so the window openings on the side elevations, east and west, with pairs of flat-headed window openings that are reduced in height in the upper story. It then talks about the veranda, and it notes that it's a newer veranda, but it's still important to the house. And then it notes the placement. So the location of the house is important. If somebody comes along and says, I want to move it, they're going to have to seek permission from the municipality because we've said the location is important. It's also important to say what's not mentioned here. So we haven't described any landscape features. So there are no, if the landscape is going to be changed, it's not a heritage attribute. And the rear elevation of the building is not discussed. It's not a heritage attribute. So if somebody wanted to add on to the rear of the building, you could do that, but go back to the earlier one where we talk about scale. So the addition to the rear would have to, if it affected the scale of the building, the form and massing, you would have to seek permission, but a rear addition could be, would be permitted. So that's the designation bylaw. So when a council is passing the designation bylaw, it should have a report before it discussing the property and evaluating. So it's a research report and it's an evaluation report. And the example for 28 Daisy Avenue, Toronto, can be found at this website. I've reproduced it, the cover of the report on the right-hand side. The report should provide the history. So this is where you can get into the details of the history of the property. It should justify the designation, and this is where you're going to use the criteria that we'll discuss later on for designating properties, and you take those criteria and you say why this property meets those criteria. It includes photographs. Photographs are important. When I worked in the City of Toronto in some of the older designations, I'd go to the file for the property, I'd open up the file, and there'd be nothing in it, no photographs. I didn't know what the property looked like when it was being designated, so photographs are important. And then the list of research sources that you've used is also important, so that should be in your report. The report you prepare should be defensible. If you're challenged, and there are opportunities for the designation to be challenged under appeal, what you put in that report should be able to be defended in a hearing. So keep that in mind when you're preparing the report. I'm not going to go through the report in detail. You can download it yourself and take a look at it. A couple of things that I do like about the format of the report. In the discussion of the history, it's got a nice little chart that sets out timelines. So there's a lot more description, but within this chart you can see a summary. When the property was patented. So from the start of the issuance of the title to the property up to when it was listed by the City of Toronto. So you can see by date what has happened on the property. Nice summary chart. The other thing I like about this designation report is that it takes each criteria and it has a nice little summary chart, and it says whether or not this property meets the criteria. So in this case, it looks at design or physical value. This is the box on the right-hand side. And then it takes each of the sub-criteria, rare, unique, representative, early example, and it put an X beside it and says, yes, it meets that. And that was further documented in the designation bylaw, in addition to being in the report and discussed in the report. But it looks at the other criteria about a high degree of craftsmanship. It says it doesn't meet it, it's not applicable, or it meets a high degree of scientific or technical achievement, it doesn't meet it. So there you see a nice little chart of which criteria it does meet. So take a look at that report. It can serve as an example for a report that you might submit to council requesting designation. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the criteria, that last little square you saw on the right-hand side of the previous chart, and we're going to see what properties can be designated, because you can't designate everything as much as you might want to. And this arises from Regulation 0906 passed by the provincial government under the Ontario Heritage Act. And it sets out criteria, and it has grouped the criteria into design or physical value, historical or associative value, or contextual value. Any property that is to be designated under the Ontario Heritage Act must meet one of those criteria. And the authority from this comes from, again, Section 29(1). The Council of Municipality may designate by bylaw a property within the municipality to be of cultural heritage value or interest if A, where the criteria for determining whether a property is of cultural heritage value or interest have been prescribed by regulation, the property meets the prescribed criteria. So yes, the criteria have been prescribed. And again, you'll see an abbreviated short form, and it may say simply Reg 0906, and the property meets the prescribed criteria. So let's look at those criteria, because this is important in defending the designation that goes forward. And this is what it says. The property has design value or physical value because it, one, is a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style, type, expression, material, or construction method. So a property doesn't have to be an early built property. It can be something that is recently built, but it is rare. The second one, it displays a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit. Or, 3, it demonstrates a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. Okay, so those are the 3 design values that you'll be looking at, and to give you some examples, ones that I've worked on, okay, this is the Graham Robinson House on the Albion Vaughan Road in the town of Caledon, and it's a representative example of its architectural style. So the Ontario House, which you saw at 28 Daisy Avenue, was also a representative example. But this one also has a high degree of craftsmanship, and it's craftsmanship that is exhibited not only on the exterior, so the brick detailing, the roof returns, the window opening, the window sashes, the door opening, the door itself, all of those, when you look at them closely, they are very finely crafted, and the interior also has some great detailing. So this meets two of those design value or physical values. Now this is a case where you've got to keep an open mind when you're asked to consider the designation of a property. And this is a pet cemetery in Aurora on Yonge Street. And it's a landscape, a cultural heritage landscape. So it's not an individual structure, it's actually a landscape that includes monuments, and it's an early example of a type of landscape. So it's an early example of a pet cemetery. And when I got the request to do this, I thought, oh no, don't tell me I've been reduced to doing pet cemeteries. But when I went out there and looked at it and then started delving into the history of this property, it really became something that grabbed me, and I could understand why the community was saying this was of value. So it's an unusual one, and it's an example where keep an open mind when you go out to consider the designation of a property. Okay, let's look at the second designation criteria, and this deals with historical value or associative value. Okay, the first one, it has direct association with a theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization, or institution that is significant to a community. So keep in mind it's got to be significant to the community, but it's broad. It's theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization. The second one, it yields or has the potential to yield information that contributes to an understanding of a community or culture. And this is one I have difficulty wrestling with, but anyhow, it's one that could be considered. And then lastly, the property has historical or associative value because it demonstrates or reflects the works or ideas of an architect, artist, builder, designer, or theorist who is significant to a community. And an example, relatively recent one, the Toronto Dominion building in Toronto, constructed in the 1960s. It's definitely worthy of designation because of its association. It was designed by a prominent international modernist architect, Mies van der Rohe, famous for his expression, less is more. And it was designed in association with local firms, John B. Parkin and Bregman and Hanna. So this is clearly an example of a relatively modern building, and I look at modern buildings that were built in my lifetime. It's worthy of designation. So don't think just 19th century, 20th century, and maybe even 21st century buildings may be worthy of designation. Here's another one, historical or associative value. This is the McDonald House on Center Street in the Thornhill portion of the city of Vaughan. And this is a case where the house and the landscape on this property have historical or associative value because they were associated with one of the members of the group of 7 architects, J.H. McDonald, painter, and it was in this garden on this property that he painted a famous painting that's hanging in the National Gallery in Ottawa called The Tangle Garden, which you see shown in the little photograph on the right-hand side of the slide. So it's the landscape and the building association with painter. Okay, the next designation criteria, the third and last, is contextual value. And here the regulation says it is important in defining, maintaining, or supporting the character of an area, is physically, functionally, visually, or historically linked to its surroundings, or is a landmark. And examples of this, okay, still in the city of Vaughan, only the Woodbridge portion, and this is the Woodbridge Memorial Tower. It's a landmark. The tower is a reference in the landscape. It's visual to all those around it. One that's less prominent in the town of Newmarket, the Union Hotel at the corner of Davis Drive and Main Street, is a landmark because of its proximity to the street. It's visually important. It's a point of reference in the landscape. And actually the building to the right-hand side is also important. It's a concrete block building, not one that's much loved in the heritage community, but it does have value because it's physically linked, not only to the property, but to the building next to it. It's also functionally linked in that it was part of the hotel. It was an annex to the hotel, even though it was a separate structure. So those are the design criteria. You have to say that the property that you want meets one of those criteria. So let's look at the effect of designating a property. What does it do? And we'll look at alterations first. And the authority here comes from the Ontario Heritage Act, Section 33(1). No owner of a property designated under Section 29 shall alter the property or permit the alteration of the property if the alteration is likely to affect the property's heritage attributes. And I underlined that term because it's important. It goes back to the bylaw. So you have to include those heritage attributes within the bylaw to deal with alterations. So as set out in the description of the heritage attributes that was required to be served and registered, as the case may be. So nobody may alter those unless the owner applies to the council of the municipality in which the property is situated and receives consent in writing to the alteration. So I emphasize again, it's limited to the heritage attributes or the way in which the alteration may affect those heritage attributes. Change is possible, so you can alter heritage building, and this is one of the things I hear when I go out and talk to people about designating their property. Say, oh, I can't change it. Yes, you can change it, but you have to do it in a sympathetic way, and you have to get council's permission. Keep in mind that council is authorized under the Ontario Heritage Act to delegate some of the approval for alterations to staff. So it may be staff that is approving it, but it's staff approval as authorized by council. Now, council has the right under the Ontario Heritage Act to require information be submitted, and many municipalities require a heritage impact assessment or other information, including plans, drawings, photographs of what exists right now, conceptual drawings of what the alteration might do to the property. So you can require information, and once you get that information, it's considered to be a complete application, provided that those information requirements are set out by your council. And once that complete application has been submitted, the clock starts ticking, and council must decide within 90 days of receiving a complete application and issuing a receipt to the owner of the property. If it does not make a decision within 90 days, it has the effect of approving that alteration. So you've got a timeline to follow. And council's decision is appealable to the Conservation Review Board. and you'll see Conservation Review Board abbreviated to CRB in later slides. So how do you evaluate a proposed alteration? You ask yourself, is this in keeping with good conservation practice? And a good guide to conservation practice is a document that's been published by Parks Canada and is on its website called the Standards and Guidelines for the Conservation of Historic Places in Canada. And it deals with alterations to structures, to heritage landscapes, and to heritage districts. It's something that you should get familiar with. So is it in keeping with good conservation practice? Does it maintain the heritage character of the property? So this is a character that's being described in your designation bylaw. Does it maintain that character? And then the other thing is the alteration, the best alternative. So are there alternatives to dealing with the problem that the alteration is being proposed for? Can you repair the heritage attribute rather than replace it? Then if you have to replace it, can you replace it with something in the same type of material, or do you have to look for a different material? So those are the sorts of questions that you should be asking when evaluating a proposed alteration. So that's dealing with alterations. Designation also has an effect on demolition. And Section 34(1) of the Ontario Heritage Act says, no owner of a property designated under Section 29 shall demolish or remove a building or structure on the property or permit the demolition or removing of a building or structure on the property unless the owner applies to the council of the municipality in which the property is situated and receives consent in writing to the demolition or removal. So demolition is possible, but it's subject to council permission. Council, unlike alterations, cannot delegate its authority. So council itself has to deal with demolitions. And again, council may require information to be submitted when someone is making a demolition application. And keep in mind that when you're proposing to demolish a building, you have to, and it's designated, the property is designated, you have to submit 2 applications, one under the Building Code and one under the Ontario Heritage Act. And if it's under the Ontario Heritage Act, your municipality may have set out requirements that must be submitted when a demolition application is being proposed. So again, when that has been all submitted, the clock starts ticking. 90 days of receipt of a complete application. So council has received the application. So this is the 90 days dates from when council receives it. And the application is complete, and it has issued a receipt to the owner that it has received it. So 90 days starts ticking again. If it doesn't make a decision within 90 days, it is deemed to have consented to the alteration. If it refuses the demolition, its decision is appealable, but in this case it's appealable to the Ontario Municipal Board. And in this case, the Ontario Municipal Board will hold a hearing, and it can act in the place of and direct the municipality to consent to the demolition. The Conservation Review Board only hears, has a hearing, and it only issues a report back to council saying we agree with the alteration, we agree or disagree with the alteration. Council doesn't have to follow the direction of the CRB. It can take it into consideration, but it can reach an alternative decision if it wants, and that decision is final. But in the case of demolition, the Ontario Municipal Board, if it's appealed to the OMB, has the final word, and it can force or order the municipality to consent to the demolition. So again, when you're looking at an application to demolish, is the demolition warranted given the submitted information? And potential loss of the heritage resource? Are there other options? Does it require the whole demolition? Can you retain in part? Can you build behind the heritage resource, meaning you don't have to remove it, but you can allow further development? Can the potential loss be mitigated? Can you salvage? And finally, if demolition is being permitted, is there appropriate documentation? You can require, as the municipality can require as a condition of demolition, salvage and documentation requirements. So designation has other effects, not just alteration and demolition, but it can be a requirement for a property tax reduction. 41 municipalities in Ontario have property tax reductions for heritage properties. Now there could be additional requirements, so it could be your municipality can require, if you were to get a property tax reduction, further heritage protection such as a heritage easement agreement, or it could also require insurance. And designation is may also be a requirement for a grant from the municipality. Designation has an additional effect. It's not something that we think of, but we should be thinking of, and this is disaster preparedness. Designation is saying to everybody else, this building has heritage value and it's so important that the municipality has designated under the Heritage Act. Treat it differently. So if your municipality has a disaster plan, how do you deal with heritage buildings? This is something you should be thinking of. And there are two examples of this. Goderich, when the cyclone came through, heritage buildings probably should have been treated differently than other buildings. When a building was partially damaged, there should have been an allowance to go in there and tarp the building, protect it from further weathering while decisions are made. You've had a fire recently in Whitby that has seriously damaged, possibly destroyed a heritage building. It could result in a demolition. There are options: partial retention, reconstruction, documentation. And there could be requirements that appropriately qualified professionals go in and look at the situation. Somebody who knows the building technology that was used, say, in the 19th century, which is different from today. Would this still stand up? So anyhow, think about designation and its impact on your municipality's disaster preparedness, and there should be a separate and different treatment for heritage properties. Designation also has an effect on planning. The provincial policy statement issued under the Planning Act, and the most recent version is 2014, applies to planning applications, but it has a heritage section. 2.6 is the heritage section, and 2.61 says significant built heritage resources and significant cultural heritage landscapes shall be conserved. So this is a requirement when a planning application is being submitted. How do you know if it's significant? If it's designated, it's clearly significant. Section 2.6.3 deals with properties that are adjacent to a heritage property. So it says, planning authorities shall not permit development and site alteration on adjacent lands to protected heritage property except where the proposed development and site alteration has been evaluated. And protected includes designated properties, and this is designated Under the Ontario Heritage Act, it's designated by the province, or it's identified by the federal government of national heritage significance. So those are the types of properties, but municipally it has to be either a Part 4 designation or a Part 5, which is heritage conservation districts. So we've dealt with the effect. Now let's deal with the process for getting a designation. And this is specified in some detail under the Ontario Heritage Act. I'm not going to go into it in great detail. Get a copy of the Act, become familiar with it, but I'm going to highlight some things in the Act. One thing which is not specified in the Act is a research report. So a research and evaluation report, like the one for 28 Daisy Avenue. If you're going to request designation and you're putting your request forward to council and you want them to designate the property, submit a research and evaluation report. Now that's not a requirement under the Act, but as you walk through the process, the defense of that designation is important. So submit your research report. Then council expresses its intent to designate. And the effect of council expressing its intent to designate is important, because once it expresses its intent, it's as good as being designated, except if it later withdraws its intent. So you can, from the date that expresses its intent, you can manage alterations and you can manage demolition, but council has to express its intent. Once it expresses its intent, it has to serve notice on the owner and the trust, and it has to publish notice of its intent to designate, and it has to consult with its municipal heritage committee. If no objection is received and the time limit is 30 days, council may pass the bylaw. The bylaw is registered on title, and again, council has to serve notice and publish the fact that it has designated the property. So that's if there is no objection. If there is an objection to the intent to designate, council must refer it to the Conservation Review Board. The CRB holds a hearing. The CRB issues a report, and as I said before, it's not a decision, it's a report to the municipal council. The council decides whether to proceed with the designation, taking into consideration the CRB report. If council proceeds with the designation, council passes the designation bylaw and registers it on title and gives notice as we discussed above. If it doesn't designate it, if it doesn't go forward, then it has to withdraw its intent to designate. So that's the process. Let's talk about heritage easement agreements, because I did mention at the last webinar that this, in fact, is a stronger tool. Designation is great, but if you can get a heritage easement agreement, that's even better. And this is authorized under the Ontario Heritage Act, Section 37(1), where it says the council of a municipality may pass bylaws providing for the entering into of easements or covenants with owners of real property or interests in real property for the conservation, it should be of property of cultural heritage value or interest. Section 37(2) says the easement is registered on title. Section 37(3) says it runs with the title. So it goes in perpetuity, and it's enforced by the municipality. Section 5 says in cases of conflict with the designation, whether it's a Part 4 designation or a Part 5 designation, easement prevails. So the easement has to be entered into with the consent of the owner. So this is a case where you have to work with the owner. And it's usually done in connection with a planning application. So frequently we secured heritage easement agreements where someone came in with a planning application, they wanted an official plan amendment, a rezoning, a consent, so to sever the property. We've said as a condition of approval, you have to enter into a heritage easement agreement. So that can be made mandatory, so they have to agree to that. It can be as a result of a grant or property tax relief. So a number of municipalities, that 41 municipalities that I mentioned earlier, have the requirement that you enter into a heritage easement agreement. Lastly, and this is important, get your municipality to put a heritage easement agreement on the property that it owns, its heritage property, because it may sell the property as surplus municipal heritage property. So as mentioned, it runs in perpetuity, and the decision of the council with respect to heritage easement agreements is final. There's no avenue of appeal. So if someone comes in and says, I want to alter my building and it's contrary to the easement agreement, the council can say no. The council can say partially yes with conditions. It can say fully yes. But whatever its decision is, there's no avenue for appeal. So a very strong instrument, and that goes for alterations and demolitions. So the form of a heritage easement agreement, this started with the Ontario Heritage Trust. They had a model easement agreement, which has been adapted by municipalities. And the standard content for this is reasons for identification, so why you're saying this property is significant. It also includes photographs, so there will be a set of photographs of the property attached to the agreement. It can include the requirement for maintenance and repair by owner. So this is something different than designation. Designation doesn't require maintenance. Now you can require some maintenance if you've got a property standards bylaw that deals with heritage properties, but a heritage easement agreement can set out that the owner has to maintain it and has to repair it, and if the owner doesn't repair it or maintain it, and this is the heritage attributes again, so that term coming back, the municipality can step in and do the maintenance and repair. So that's maintenance and repair. Heritage easement agreement can specify permitted alterations. The heritage easement agreement usually requires that the property be insured and that the municipality is a named party on the insurance policy. So if there are proceeds coming from the insurance policy, the municipality has a say over those proceeds, and it also sets out that the proceeds are from the insurance policy are to be used for restoration repair if the building is damaged. And again, if it's damaged and the owner doesn't, then the easement agreement says the municipality can step in and reconstruct if the owner fails to and can charge the owner. And it also, there's usually control over any signage that is applied to the building that's specified in the heritage easement agreement, and that the municipality can put a plaque on the property. So those are the normally the standard requirements that are put into a heritage easement agreement. And I'm sorry I could not find a heritage easement agreement on the website, on any website, but maybe your municipality or a neighboring municipality has one and you can get an example of it. Additional resources where you're looking for Part 4 designation, the Ontario Heritage Toolkit, which is on the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sports website, and you see a picture of it designating heritage properties. It goes through many of the things that I've set out in the previous slides. And on heritage easement agreements, the City of Markham has on its website something called Heritage Matters, and it deals with heritage easement agreements, although it doesn't give you a specific heritage easement agreement, but it explains what it is along the lines that I've set out. So, to understand how other municipal heritage committees and municipalities are using Part 4 designation and heritage easement agreements, I strongly suggest you join Community Heritage Ontario. Individuals and municipal heritage committees can be members of Community Heritage Easement, Community Heritage Ontario. And with that, I'll end my presentation and turn it over for questions. So, what have we got?
So far, this is Sarah again. So far, I've got two questions. The first one, Wayne, is can you have more than one designated property covered in a bylaw with schedules and reasons for each property? And this question is from Roslyn.
Okay, can you hear me? The Ontario Heritage Act doesn't restrict you to just one property in a designation bylaw, but I wouldn't suggest that. It's usually best, in my view, to have separate bylaws for separate properties, because in the future something could happen to one property that doesn't happen to the other property. They could be a different ownership, and you could end up having to register changes to that bylaw on both properties rather than just on the one that is being, an alteration is being requested or a change to the designation bylaw is required. So although it doesn't require it, my advice is keep a separate bylaw for each property. If you're looking for groups of properties worthy of designation and they're adjacent, then that's where you move into Part 5 designations, heritage conservation districts. Okay.
So we do have a second question. Wayne, can you offer property tax relief without having a heritage easement agreement?
Well, the conditions for a heritage easement, the conditions for property tax reduction are up to the municipality to decide. I do strongly suggest entering into an agreement because the municipality is giving something to the property owner. You want something more than just an individual designation than a heritage easement agreement, or than just the individual designation provides. To give you an example, you could be giving property tax reductions to a property owner, not have any heritage easement agreement on the property owner. The owner sells the property. The next owner comes along and says, I don't like the designation, I'm going to appeal to the Ontario Municipal Board, and for whatever reason the OMB could direct the municipality to remove the designation bylaw. They have to do it. So you've given money in the past to this property to protect that heritage resource, but you've now lost it because you didn't have a heritage easement agreement. So I strongly recommend that there be a heritage easement agreement or some similar type instrument that runs in perpetuity with the property. You can vary the conditions of a heritage easement agreement. Maybe you think a schedule of permitted alterations is not appropriate in this case. You don't have to put that in. Maybe you don't think that the municipality should be getting involved in heritage or in insurance on the property. You don't have to put that clause in. But I think you should be putting something that runs in perpetuity on title to the property that says this is heritage building, and it's something that can't be appealed. So that's my opinion, but it's up to your municipality to decide under what conditions it'll give for property tax relief.
We have another question, Wayne. Can you provide an example of relief from the Ontario Building Code as a result of a Part 4?
Sure. Section 11 of the Building Code allows the chief building official just starting again. Section 11 of the Building Code allows the chief building official to make exceptions to the code, and one of the ways in which he can make the exception is if the property is designated under either Part 4 or Part 5 under the Ontario Heritage Act. So he can make a variety of exceptions, although there has to be a demonstration that the alternative that is being proposed will not adversely affect the safety of occupants in the property. So there has to be some demonstration shown if a similar exception has not been granted before. So as an example, in my house in Newmarket, which was designated under Part 4, there were old fireplaces in the house. We wanted to reuse those fireplaces, wood or coal-burning fireplaces. The brick insulating layer between the mantelpiece and the opening in which the fire takes place didn't meet current code requirements. I was altering the building. I would have had to meet the code. An exception was granted when we came up with an alternative to take the fireplace off, put a backing on the mantelpiece, or take the mantelpiece off, put a backing on the mantelpiece that enhanced the fireproof of that mantelpiece, and applied it back on. You couldn't see that change, but it was something that was allowed. Otherwise, I would have had to tear the face of the fireplace, the brick fireplace, off and rebuild it using more recent building code requirements. So it can get into that sort of thing. It can get into situations where you're dealing with a staircase, the treads and risers of the staircase don't meet current building code requirements. You've got to make an alteration, but your opening is not big enough. Again, the chief building official may make exceptions using Section 11 of the Building Code. It's something that you should take a look at. And for a chief building official, the terminology that they use when it comes to heritage designation is applicable law. So you'll see that in the Building Code. What is the applicable law? In the Ontario Heritage Act, Section 29 designation is deemed to be, or set out in the Building Code as being applicable law.
So Wayne, we have one last question for you. What is the advantage of municipalities designating their own properties?
Okay. One advantage, I wouldn't call it an advantage so much as ensuring an appropriate outcome later on. But as a municipality moves through its life, and later on it may decide that it doesn't need the property anymore. There is a designation bylaw in place when it sells that property. So there's already protection on the property, and the new owner acquiring that property is aware of it because it's been placed on title, and his lawyer would have advised him you're dealing with a designated property. The other advantage, this is showing to the community good stewardship. So the municipality is saying when it designates its own property, look, I'm asking you as a private owner to designate your property. I as a public owner am agreeing to designation, and I'm following the rules. So they would have to consult with their municipal heritage committee if they're going to make an alteration. So I'm following the rules that you have to follow. I'm being a good steward. I'm setting a good example. So I think those are the two best reasons. And I'll add a little bit more. In designating Part 4 properties under the Ontario Heritage Act, municipalities are not allowed to designate senior government properties. Or if they do, the effect of that is null and void, because a municipality cannot direct senior government to do something if it doesn't want to. So that's the rule of thumb. Now, when I was on the municipal committee in Newmarket, we had a post office owned by the federal government, and we thought it was quite significant. It was on our inventory, which at that point in time didn't have any legal authority. And we went to the municipality and said, designate it. You know, put a designation bylaw in place, and let's see what the federal government does. And so the municipality did designate a senior government property, the post office, and the federal government did nothing because, you know, it doesn't have any effect with the federal government as the owner. But then the federal government declared the property to be surplus. The next owner came along, or the new owner purchasing the property knew right away that there was a heritage bylaw untitled to this property. So as soon as the federal government ceased to be owner, he became subject to that designation bylaw. So, you know, see what you can do with it. But anyhow, that's the experience with designating government properties. Anyhow, no more? Okay, thank you very much, and maybe you'll be on for Heritage Conservation Districts, the next webinar.